On the morning of June 6, 1944, at approximately 6:30 a.m., Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Hitler's most celebrated general, was 600 miles away from the beaches of Normandy. He was in Germany with his wife, celebrating her birthday. While American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the shores of France in the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the man responsible for stopping them wasn't even in France. But this wasn't incompetence. This wasn't negligence. This was the culmination of 6 months of warnings, pleas, and strategic arguments that had been systematically ignored by Adolf Hitler himself. For months, Rommel had been screaming into the void. He knew where the invasion would come, he knew when it would happen, he knew exactly what needed to be done to stop it. And he had told Hitler everything in excruciating detail. Every weakness in the Atlantic Wall, every gap in their defenses, every strategic error that would cost Germany the war. Hitler had listened, and then he had done nothing. By 10:15 a.m. on June 6, when Rommel's staff car was racing back toward France at maximum speed, his face was reportedly pale, his jaw clenched. His aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, would later recall that Rommel spoke only once during that entire frantic journey. 7 words that revealed everything he was thinking in that moment. "I was right, and now we've lost." This is the story of what Rommel really thought when Hitler ignored his warnings about D-Day. This is the story of a general who saw the future, tried to change it, and watched helplessly as his predictions became reality. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why June 6, 1944 didn't just mark the beginning of Germany's defeat. It marked the moment Rommel realized he'd been fighting for the wrong side all along. The official narrative, the one promoted by both Allied propaganda and post-war German memoirs, presents a simple story. The Allies outsmarted the Germans. Eisenhower's deception plan, Operation Fortitude, convinced Hitler the invasion would come at Calais. The Germans were caught flat-footed, disorganized, and unprepared. It's a comfortable story. It makes D-Day seem inevitable, destined. But that's not what happened. The reality is far more disturbing, because someone on the German side did see it coming. Someone did understand exactly where and how the Allies would strike. Someone did develop a comprehensive defense plan that might have thrown the invasion back into the sea. His name was Erwin Rommel. And Hitler refused to listen. In November 1943, Rommel had been appointed Inspector of Coastal Defenses in France, and by December, he'd been given command of Army Group B, the forces responsible for defending northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Hitler had sent him with a simple mandate: turn the Atlantic Wall into an impregnable fortress. Rommel spent his first weeks touring the coastline, inspecting every bunker, every gun emplacement, every beach obstacle. What he found horrified him. The Atlantic Wall was a propaganda myth, a facade, impressive from a distance, catastrophically inadequate up close. At a commander's conference in Paris on December 20, 1943, Rommel stood before a room full of generals and delivered an assessment that left them stunned. "Gentlemen," he said, "if the enemy once gets his foot in the door, we will not throw him out again. The Atlantic Wall is not a wall, it's barely a fence." The room went silent. But Rommel wasn't finished. Over the next 6 months, he would transform from Hitler's loyal field marshal into something far more dangerous, a realist. A man who understood that Germany was losing the war and that the only question now was how many lives would be wasted before the inevitable end. He just didn't realize yet that Hitler had already decided the answer: all of them. By January 1944, Rommel had drafted a detailed memorandum for Hitler. It outlined 3 critical facts. First, the invasion would most likely come in Normandy, not Calais. Second, it would happen in late May or early June when weather and tides aligned. Third, Germany's only chance of survival was to defeat the invasion on the beaches within the first 24 hours. If the Allies established a beachhead, Rommel wrote, the war was over. Hitler read the memorandum, he filed it away, and then he ignored it completely. To understand what Rommel was thinking, you have to understand who Rommel was. Not the propaganda image, the dashing desert fox, the gentleman general, the tactical genius. The real man. Erwin Rommel was 52 years old in 1944. He'd been a soldier for 34 years. He'd fought in World War I, earning the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, for his actions in Italy. He'd risen through the ranks not through politics or connections, but through audacity, tactical brilliance, and an almost supernatural ability to read a battlefield. But by 1944, something had changed in Rommel. The confidence was still there. The tactical genius remained intact. But there was something else now, something his staff officers noticed but rarely discussed openly. Doubt. In North Africa, Rommel had fought against overwhelming Allied superiority in men, tanks, and supplies. He'd watched his soldiers die because Hitler refused to send adequate resources. He'd been promised reinforcements that never came, supplies that never arrived, air support that never materialized. And he'd lost, not because of poor tactics or weak morale, but because Germany's industrial capacity couldn't compete with America's. It was mathematics, not courage, that had defeated him in the desert. Now in France he was seeing the same pattern repeat itself, and this time the stakes were infinitely higher. Rommel's chief of staff, General Hans Spadel, would later write that Rommel had become obsessed with stopping the invasion in the first 24 hours. Not because he believed in ultimate German victory, but because he believed it was the only way to negotiate an honorable peace with the Western Allies before the Soviets overran Europe. This was borderline treasonous thinking, and Rommel knew it. But he also knew something else: Hitler was insane. Not metaphorically, not as an insult, literally clinically losing touch with reality. Rommel had seen it firsthand during meetings at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. The Führer's hands trembled, his left leg shook uncontrollably. He flew into rages over minor tactical details, screaming at generals who'd spent their entire lives studying warfare. And worst of all, Hitler had stopped listening to reality. He made decisions based on ideology, intuition, and increasingly paranoid delusions about treachery within his own ranks. In February 1944, Rommel had traveled to the Berghof for a personal meeting with Hitler. He'd brought maps, intelligence reports, and detailed strategic analyses. He'd argued that the panzer divisions, Germany's mobile reserves, needed to be positioned near the coast, close enough to reach the beaches within hours of an invasion. Hitler had listened politely. Then he'd explained with the calm certainty of a madman that the invasion would come at Calais. The Allies would never risk their invasion fleet in the treacherous waters off Normandy. They needed the short crossing from Dover to Calais, the large port facilities, the direct route to Germany. Rommel had countered every point. The Allies didn't need port facilities, they'd bring their own. Mulberry harbors, floating docks, prefabricated ports. Intelligence suggested they had the technology to supply an invasion force across open beaches. Hitler had smiled indulgently, as one might smile at a bright but misguided child. "Rommel," he'd said, "you worry too much, trust me, Calais." That was the moment. That was when Rommel realized he wasn't arguing with a strategic genius. He was arguing with a man who'd confused his own propaganda with reality. But Rommel was still a German officer, still bound by his oath, still trapped between his duty to his country and his duty to a leader who was leading that country to destruction. So he did the only thing he could do. He went back to France and prepared to fight with whatever resources Hitler was willing to give him. Which, as it turned out, was almost nothing. Between January and May 1944, Rommel launched what can only be described as a one-man war against German military bureaucracy, strategic inertia, and Hitler's increasingly detached leadership. He needed millions of mines. He got thousands. He needed thousands of concrete bunkers. He got hundreds. He needed the panzer divisions positioned within striking distance of the coast. Hitler kept them hundreds of miles inland under the direct control of the High Command in Berlin. At a crucial meeting on March 20, 1944, Rommel confronted Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West and technically Rommel's superior. Von Rundstedt was old-school Prussian military aristocracy, formal, traditional, and fundamentally pessimistic about Germany's chances. The two men represented completely different strategic philosophies. Von Rundstedt believed in defense in depth, letting the Allies land, then crushing them with massive panzer counterattacks once their intentions became clear. Rommel believed the opposite: stop them on the beaches or don't bother stopping them at all. "The enemy will never allow us time for large-scale operations," Rommel argued. "Their air superiority is total. Any major troop movement in daylight will be annihilated from the air. We must win this battle in the first 24 hours or we will not win it at all." Von Rundstedt had looked at him with something approaching pity. "My dear Rommel," he'd replied, "we lost this war the moment we failed to defeat Britain in 1940. Everything since then has been a slow march toward inevitable defeat. The only question is how many of our cities will be rubble before Hitler admits it." The conversation had ended there, because what von Rundstedt had just said was technically high treason and both men knew it, but neither reported the other. By early 1944, this kind of defeatist realism was surprisingly common among senior German commanders. They just couldn't say it publicly. So Rommel returned to what he could control: the physical defenses. If Hitler wouldn't give him the resources to win, he'd improvise with what he had. By May 1944, he'd overseen the construction of 500,000 beach obstacles, Wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, concrete tetrahedrons, all designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. He'd laid over 4 million mines along the coast. He'd reinforced key defensive positions and positioned his most reliable units at the most likely invasion points, including Normandy's. Because despite Hitler's insistence on Calais, Rommel had quietly positioned significant defensive forces around the Normandy beaches. Not enough to stop an invasion, but enough to make the Allies pay in blood. Then came late May. The weather was perfect, tides were optimal. Intelligence reports indicated massive Allied buildup in southern England. Every sign pointed to invasion within days. Rommel requested an emergency meeting with Hitler. He was told the Führer was unavailable, too busy with strategic planning. On June 4th, the weather turned. A massive storm system moved across the channel, winds reaching 40 miles per hour, heavy rain, rough seas. The German Meteorological Service predicted the storm would last at least 2 weeks. Rommel allowed himself to hope. Maybe they'd bought more time. Maybe he could use these extra weeks to convince Hitler to move the panzer reserves forward. On June 5th, Rommel made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife's birthday was June 6th. He hadn't seen her in months. The invasion was impossible in this weather. He'd take a quick trip back to Germany, deliver her birthday present, a pair of shoes he'd bought in Paris, then return to his headquarters on June 7th. Before he left, he scheduled a meeting with Hitler for June 8th. This time, he'd demand control of the panzer reserves. No more polite requests, no more strategic memorandums. He'd force the issue even if it meant threatening resignation. At approximately 5:00 p.m. on June 5th, Rommel's staff car left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, heading east toward Germany. 15 hours later, at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, the first wave of Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy. The phone call came at approximately 10:15 a.m. Rommel and his wife were having a late breakfast at their home in Herrlingen, Germany. Outside, the weather was pleasant, sunny, mild, a perfect summer morning. Inside, Rommel was relaxed, smiling, enjoying a rare moment of domestic peace. Then Captain Helmuth Lang, his aide, entered the room. His face was ashen. "Sir," he said quietly, "headquarters is on the line, it's urgent." Rommel took the call in his study. General Hans Spadel, his chief of staff, was on the line. Spadel's voice was steady but strained, the voice of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have to share. "Sir, the invasion has begun. Multiple landings along the Normandy coast. American, British, and Canadian forces. Estimates suggest over 100,000 troops already ashore. Airborne divisions dropped inland during the night. We're engaging, but, sir, it's massive, larger than anything we anticipated." There was a long silence. Spadel would later recall that the pause lasted at least 10 seconds, an eternity in a phone conversation between military officers during an emergency. When Rommel spoke, his voice was perfectly calm. "Has Berlin released the panzer reserves?" Another pause, shorter this time. "No, sir, we've requested authorization multiple times. The High Command says the Führer is sleeping and has left orders not to be disturbed. They're waiting for him to wake up." Another silence, longer this time. "I see," Rommel said finally. "I'm leaving immediately." He hung up the phone, walked back to the breakfast room, looked at his wife with an expression she would later describe as absolutely empty of hope. "I have to go," he said. "The invasion has started in Normandy, exactly where I said it would be." The drive back to France took nearly 15 hours. Captain Lang drove while Rommel sat in the backseat, silent, occasionally looking at maps, mostly just staring out the window. They stopped once for fuel. While the attendant filled the tank, Rommel got out, stretched his legs, and lit a cigarette. Lang approached him, hesitant. "Sir, we're still hours from headquarters. Should I radio for a situation update?" Rommel took a long drag on his cigarette. "No need, Captain. I know exactly what's happening. The Allies are establishing their beachhead. Our men are fighting and dying without armor support. And Hitler is either asleep or arguing with his generals about whether this is the real invasion or a diversion. By the time he makes a decision, it will be too late." "But sir, surely once the panzer divisions reach the coast." Rommel cut him off with a look. "The panzer divisions will be destroyed from the air long before they reach the coast. I've been watching Allied air superiority grow for 6 months. They own the sky, Captain, completely. Any major troop movement in daylight will be spotted and annihilated within hours. We needed those tanks positioned near the coast before the invasion. Now," he dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Now they're just targets." They arrived at La Roche-Guyon at approximately 9:30 p.m. Rommel walked into his headquarters to find organized chaos. Staff officers shouting into phones, runners delivering messages, radio operators trying to coordinate with units under fire. General Spadel briefed him on the situation. It was worse than Rommel had feared. The Allies had achieved complete tactical surprise. Despite all his preparations, despite the beach obstacles and mines, despite the defensive positions, the sheer scale of the invasion had overwhelmed the German defenders. 5 beaches, thousands of ships. Air superiority so complete that German reinforcements couldn't move during daylight without being strafed by fighter bombers. And the panzer divisions, still hundreds of miles inland, still waiting for Hitler's authorization to move. Rommel listened to the briefing in silence. Then he asked one question: when did Berlin finally release the reserves? Spadel checked his notes. Approximately 4:00 p.m., sir, 9.5 hours after the invasion began. Rommel nodded slowly. He walked to the situation map, studied it for several minutes, then turned to face his staff. Gentlemen, he said quietly, we are about to fight a defensive battle against an enemy with total air superiority, overwhelming material advantage, and secure supply lines across open beaches, something we all said was impossible. We will fight because that is our duty. We will inflict casualties because we are soldiers, but we will not win. This invasion will not be thrown back into the sea. The war, for all practical purposes, is over. Germany just doesn't know it yet. The room fell completely silent. What Rommel had just said was treason, defeatism, grounds for immediate arrest and execution. Nobody moved to arrest him, because every officer in that room knew he was right. Over the next 4 weeks, Rommel fought what he later described as a battle without hope. His forces inflicted heavy casualties on Allied troops, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American losses were catastrophic. But casualties meant nothing when the enemy could replace every lost soldier, every destroyed tank, every shot-down aircraft within days. Meanwhile, Germany's losses were irreplaceable. By June 10th, Hitler finally agreed to meet with his commanders in France. Rommel and von Rundstedt traveled to Soissons, where Hitler had established a temporary command post in a bunker complex. The meeting was a disaster. Rommel presented his case with brutal honesty. The invasion could not be stopped. The Allies were bringing supplies ashore faster than Germany could mount counterattacks. Every day, the beachhead grew stronger. The only rational option was to withdraw German forces to a more defensible line inland, negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, and redirect all resources to the Eastern Front to hold off the Soviets. Hitler listened with increasing rage. When Rommel finished, the furor exploded. Negotiate, negotiate. With the criminals who bombed Dresden, with the Bolsheviks who raped their way across Prussia, you want me to surrender? I want you to save what's left of Germany, Rommel replied. His voice was steady, but his staff officers would later recall that his hands were trembling. Sir, I've fought this war from North Africa to France. I've seen our industrial capacity, our manpower reserves, our strategic position deteriorate month by month. We cannot win, but we might still save Germany from complete destruction if we act now. Hitler stared at him. The room was silent. Then Hitler spoke, his voice dropping to a near whisper, which was somehow more frightening than his screaming. Field Marshal Rommel, he said, your duty is not to question policy. Your duty is to fight. If you cannot do that, I will find someone who can. The meeting ended. Rommel and von Rundstedt returned to France. On the drive back, von Rundstedt spoke only once. He's going to get us all killed, you know. I know, Rommel replied. By late June, the situation in Normandy had become catastrophic. Allied forces had broken out of their initial beachhead and were pushing inland. German casualties were mounting faster than replacements could arrive, and Hitler's response to every setback was the same: hold at all costs, no retreat, fight to the last man. Rommel began to realize that Hitler wasn't just refusing to face reality, he was actively choosing destruction. Germany's defeat was no longer Hitler's greatest fear. Hitler's greatest fear was surviving that defeat to face judgment for his crimes. So if Hitler was going to fall, he was going to take all of Germany down with him. On July 15, 1944, Rommel wrote a letter to Hitler. It was his final attempt to inject reality into German strategy. The letter was remarkably blunt, almost suicidal in its honesty. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, Rommel wrote, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay. I feel it my duty as Commander-in-Chief of the Army Group to state this clearly. The letter was never delivered. 2 days later, on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British fighter bombers on a road near Saint-Foy-de-Montgomery. The driver was killed. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, suffering a fractured skull, facial injuries, and a concussion. He would never return to active command. Rommel spent the next 2 months recovering at his home in Herrlingen. He was visited regularly by German intelligence officers, ostensibly checking on his health, but actually investigating his connections to the plot to assassinate Hitler. Because on July 20, 1944, just 3 days after Rommel's injury, a bomb had exploded in Hitler's headquarters during a staff meeting. Hitler survived with minor injuries. Dozens of officers and officials were arrested and executed in the aftermath. And under torture, some of them mentioned Rommel's name. The evidence of Rommel's direct involvement in the assassination plot is ambiguous. He definitely knew about the conspiracy. He'd met with some of the plotters. He'd expressed sympathy for their goals. But whether he actively participated or merely turned a blind eye remains debated by historians. What's certain is that Hitler believed Rommel was involved, and Hitler wanted him dead. But Rommel was too popular to simply execute. The Desert Fox was a propaganda icon. His death would raise questions, create sympathy, maybe even spark resistance among German troops. So Hitler offered him a choice. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home. They explained the situation with bureaucratic efficiency. Rommel was implicated in the July 20th plot. The evidence was strong enough for trial. But the Führer, in his mercy, was offering an alternative. Rommel could take poison, die quietly at home, receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be protected, his reputation preserved, his pension paid. Or he could face trial for treason, be publicly humiliated, executed, his family arrested, his name disgraced forever. Rommel had 15 minutes to decide. He kissed his wife goodbye, told his son to serve Germany, not the regime, walked outside to the waiting vehicle, and took the pill. At approximately 1:00 p.m. on October 14, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Hitler's most celebrated general, the man who'd warned about D-Day and been ignored, died of cyanide poisoning. The official cause of death was announced as complications from his earlier war injuries. He was given a state funeral on October 18th. Hitler sent a wreath. Field Marshal von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy, his voice reportedly breaking with emotion, though whether from grief or shame, witnesses couldn't agree. The truth about Rommel's death wouldn't emerge until after the war, when Allied investigators interviewed his family and staff officers. Rommel's story raises a question that echoes through history. What do you do when you serve a cause you've begun to realize is evil, under a leader you've begun to realize is insane? He'd seen the truth about Hitler. He'd understood that Germany was fighting for a regime that would destroy the country it claimed to protect. He'd recognized that duty to Germany and duty to Hitler were no longer the same thing. But recognition isn't the same as action. Understanding isn't the same as courage. Rommel spent the last months of his life caught between his oath and his conscience. He wanted to save Germany, but he couldn't quite bring himself to actively betray Hitler. So he occupied a middle ground, not quite a conspirator, not quite loyal, warning without rebelling, questioning without refusing. And in the end, that middle ground saved no one. Not Germany, not the soldiers under his command, not even himself. The tragedy of Rommel isn't that he failed to stop D-Day. That was probably impossible regardless of his warnings. The tragedy is that he saw clearly what Hitler saw it months, maybe years before his death, and still couldn't break free from the oath he'd sworn to a monster. On June 6, 1944, when Rommel received that phone call at 10:15 a.m., he realized that everything he'd warned about had come true. The invasion was happening exactly where he'd predicted, exactly when he'd predicted, and it couldn't be stopped because Hitler had ignored every warning, refused every request, and dismissed every strategic recommendation. Rommel was right about D-Day, completely, tragically right. But being right didn't save him, because in totalitarian systems, being right is often more dangerous than being wrong. The truth doesn't set you free. The truth gets you a visit from two generals and a suicide pill. As we watch the grainy footage of that massive invasion fleet heading toward the beaches of Normandy, over 5,000 ships, 160,000 men, the largest amphibious operation in human history, we should remember the man who wasn't there. The general who knew it was coming, who tried to stop it, who was ignored by his leader, and who died knowing he'd been right all along. Rommel once told his son, "I would rather be a private in a democracy than a field marshal in a dictatorship." He never got the chance to make that choice. Neither did the millions of soldiers on both sides who died because men like Hitler refused to listen to reason. That's the real lesson of D-Day. Not just that the Allies won or that Germany lost, but that somewhere in Germany, a field marshal sat in his study on the morning of June 6th, listening to reports of an invasion he'd predicted 6 months earlier, and realized that competence, experience, and truth mean nothing when your leader has stopped living in reality. And that by the time you realize you're serving madness, it's already too late to save yourself. Or anyone else.